Hey guys, so it is Miscellaneous Monday here on the Daily Vape. It is beautiful up here in the Northwest today. We are having definitely spring weather. Hopefully it's nice where you're at. And before we get started, I'll let you guys know what I'm vaping on today. So I have the Camry K1000 EPipe, which is basically just a mechanical mod here with a tailpipe shaped like a pipe. And I'm vaping on it with my Nautilus Aspire tank, probably the best adjustable airflow tank on the market right now. So I'll put a link under this video where you can get both of these if you guys want to check them out. So talking about ancient Greece and that period of time, that really is from my field of study when I was at the university. So before we got into the Trojan War today, I thought I'd give you guys just a little bit of my background. I get people asking me all the time to tell more about my personal background and things. So I figured today I would give you guys just a little bit of my educational background. Nice. Alright, so first I'll tell you guys I spent a lot of years at the university. I was what we used to call in the academic fields a professional student. I rode that shit for 7 years until all my financial aid ran out, and I finally had to just decide whether I was going to commit, go into a PhD program, and basically make teaching my career, or whether I was going to do something else. Because it was something, for a lot of reasons, I'd kind of gotten discouraged by that point on the idea of teaching for a living. But anyways, I'll tell you guys a little bit about the background though. And so for a lot of people who asked if I ever taught or lectured, I did actually. When I was working on my master's degree in philosophy, I was a student teacher and I lectured and basically taught an entire class one quarter while the teacher or professor just kind of checked in once in a while. I did all the correcting of papers, graded the exams, everything basically all the way through. So yes, I do have a background in that. I had done a once-a-month lecture in philosophy for about 2 years that became very famous, and we would end up having standing room only. Pissed off my professor, the head of the department, because we'd get about half the class to show up all the rest of the month, and then I would do my lecture and we'd have standing room only. But even at that, it was maybe like 100 people or so. I can do a lecture right now, the same lecture I would have given then, and have 10,000 people see it. So in my 7 years, I was able to get degrees in philosophy, history, and anthropology with minors in political science and humanities. So all stuff that you ain't gonna go out and get a job with. So I basically spent 7 years filling my head with shit that you can't put on a resume. So that was really helpful when I got out. But that is why I would much rather sit here and talk about the Trojan War than sit here and wind a coil or see how big of a vapor cloud I can blow. And graduate from ITT Tech. I'm a philosophy major. So I've always followed history from a three-pronged approach. You follow it from the mind, the body, and the soul of the creature, just like you would follow an individual. Socrates divided the individual up into 3 parts: mind, body, soul. Mind is what we would call today the brain, basically, your thinking, your analytic part. The body is, of course, all your appetites and aversions, your fears, your ambitions, your passions, everything that's kind of a physical base desire type thing. Then the soul is what they considered your true self, the active, deciding part that has to choose between mind and body in almost every decision. So that is what we would call today, I think, your soul, what you take with you, that part that transcends mind and body or brain and, you know, physical, corporeal substance. So I look at history and the history of the human race the same way. I like to follow it through philosophy. The history of philosophy is the history of the mind, the history of thought of the human race, and the great debate and how that's developed over centuries and millennia. History itself is the history of the events, the actions, the wars, the revolts, the big discoveries, all of the big physical events in history. It's like the physical body of the beast, so you follow that. And then through literature, you understand the soul, the spirit, the passions, the desires, the dramas, all those things that make up sort of the heart and soul of humanity. So that you get from Dostoevsky, Dickens, Melville, all the great writers. The human experience comes to life. Alright, so that was an all too brief history of my educational background. Now let's move on to something interesting. The Trojan War. So if you're looking at Troy, you're talking about a small city basically on the edge of Turkey, right across the Mediterranean from the Greek-speaking states at that time. So you're basically talking about 2 fairly distinct civilizations, although somewhat close in proximity to one another. Alright, so we get most of the story of the Trojan War from the Iliad, the book Homer wrote, but there's actually tons of other sources, tons of other stories that have been handed down from bards. We're talking about something now that was basically ancient history to the ancient Greeks. I mean, even at the time of the Battle of Thermopylae Pass, the 300, the Trojan War would have been about 800 years before that. So the stories and the tales are the kinds of things they would have been talking about probably the night before their big battle. So it's all mixed in with legend and myth and real historical accuracy. They have actually found archaeological sites of the burning of Troy dated to about the 12th or 11th century BC. So there is some historical evidence also to back all this up. But now, of course, all the details and the dramas and the specifics, that, of course, we could never know. So I'm basically looking to break this down and give you guys the story of the event and not worry so much about all the little minute details. I know I leave out a lot of details, even talking about the 300 and the Battle of Thermopylae Pass. Of course, several people pointed out that they would have had a lot of hoplites with them, hundreds of assist units. But the fact is, even in modern day warfare, they say it takes 7 assist units just to keep the supply lines going for every 1 unit in the battlefield. So it wouldn't have been that different back then. You would have had people cooking the food, cleaning the latrines, doing that type of thing. But when I'm trying to give an inspirational, motivational story about the 300, I feel like that's beside the point. Nobody's getting too motivated about the guys who are cleaning out the latrines. They want to hear about the guys who are fighting the battles on the front lines. Alright, so the same thing's true with the Trojan War. I'm going to basically give you guys the highlights, interesting shit, and kind of leave out the minutia. So it all starts and revolves somewhat around Helen of Troy, probably one of the most famous female characters in all of history. Famous both for her beauty, but also a little bit of her cunning and deception, possibly. Definitely had a famous sister as well, Clytemnestra, with also a very famous husband. So, Helen has basically got a reputation around in Sparta. She has lots of suitors. She is currently married to King Menelaus, who is one of the most famous kings in all of Sparta. Now, her sister, Clytemnestra, is married to Agamemnon, who is one of the most powerful kings in all of the Greek-speaking world. That's where the real problem comes in. Now, Helen was obviously very rich, but whether or not she was a gold digger, that's up for debate, because she probably was forced into the marriage anyways, but obviously King Menelaus was much older than her. And so here comes this handsome, good-looking guy, Paris, from Troy. You know, he's basically one of the swarthy types. Tall, dark, and handsome, young, good-looking guy. So she falls in love with Paris, he falls in love with her. They run off together. Now, how the fuck does one couple eloping start one of the greatest conflicts in human history? When you hear the reference to the face that launched 1,000 ships, that is the reference to Helen starting the war against Troy, which Greece launched 1,000 warships. So the whole problem here is that King Menelaus' brother-in-law is Agamemnon. Now, Agamemnon, being one of the most powerful kings in Sparta, he's been looking for a reason to go to war with Troy. Troy's this big, powerful, fancy empire just on the other side of the Mediterranean, tons of money, all kinds of shit. Now, Agamemnon's thinking we could go up there and we could take those motherfuckers. They're a bunch of metrosexual girly boys. They ain't tough like us Spartans. Probably do this quick, you know? So, what is Paris and Helen, and how does Paris taking Helen from Menelaus correlate in going to war? One word, pretext. That's all Agamemnon needed, was a pretext to start the conflict. And this blatant insult was enough of a pretext to basically start the war. Now, interestingly, although varying from the story in the Iliad, there are other accounts which basically have Paris and Helen in Egypt at the time that the Greeks arrived at Troy. And so the Trojans came out and said, hey, guess what? You guys been fooled, man. They ain't even here. They're over in fucking Egypt honeymooning and shit. So, sorry for you wasted your time. Well, of course, that didn't fucking divert the Greeks. They didn't give a shit about that. They were really there to take Troy down. So the war starts, and then Paris and Helen would return to Troy later after they found out it was under siege. So basically, you got a whole bunch of Greek speakers, including being instigated by the Spartans, who you know are always looking for a fight. And this is where you get some of your famous stories about some of your great Greek warriors like Achilles. So the famous story with Achilles is that he had two options, that his life could go two different paths. He could either be a family man, stay at home, raise kids, and he would live a long and happy life, but only be remembered by his kids and grandkids basically and forgotten throughout history. Or he could live the life of a warrior, but he was going to die very young, but would be remembered forever throughout history as one of the greatest warriors of all time. So you guys don't have to, so it don't take much to guess which path he took. So Achilles becomes one of the main players in this battle because him and Agamemnon have a big falling out over one of the raids where Achilles takes hostage one of the slaves from Troy. And I don't know why, but she's especially beautiful or something, so he's got a real fancy to her. Agamemnon sees her and says, hell, man, I'm the fucking ruling commander of this shit. I get first pickings. So he takes her from Achilles, and basically that starts a whole dispute between Achilles and Agamemnon, and then Achilles refuses to fight. So the war doesn't go too well. It ends up being 10 years that they are in Troy. So your main players in Troy, you got Paris, you got his brother Hector, breaker of horses, and you got Priam, the father. He's the Trojan king at that time. So even while the main war is going on, you got all the subplots of Helen and Paris, and you've got Achilles and Agamemnon and their dispute, and then you've got Hector and Achilles because they're gunning for each other the whole time. Now Hector is the big brother of Paris. He's actually next in line to be the king of the Trojans and is actually a much more serious guy than Paris is. So he's basically the counterpart to Achilles. He's the Trojans' greatest warrior. So the whole time they're gunning, man, you know the two of them got to have it out. This is like the big battle. This is the heavyweight fight that everybody's been waiting for. So there's basically a scene where Achilles is refusing to fight because he's pissed off at Agamemnon because he took his chick. So he's sulking and shit. So then his cousin, because they need to motivate the troops, and without Achilles there, nobody's wanting to fight all that much. They all know that, fuck man, he ain't in it. We ain't really, you know, we're not 100%. So Achilles' little cousin dresses up like him and dresses in his uniform, goes out and pretends to be Achilles, and a lot of the warriors actually think he is Achilles, and they all rush with him and go fighting extra hard, and they fight up to the front. Well, then Hector comes out, has the big fight with him, kills him, and then realizes it's not actually Achilles, that it's just his little cousin. And so then everybody's like, damn, you just fucking killed Achilles' cousin, dude. Now you in the shit. So anyways, that brings Achilles out basically to fight Hector now because now it's personal. So the two of them fight and Achilles wins. He kills Hector, drags his body around Troy like 3 times behind his horses, just fucking tearing it asunder. Just basically so, you know, he can't get the ritual, respect, burial, the whole thing he's supposed to get. He basically is, you know, treating it like garbage. But then this is where Achilles finally meets his match. Because if you know the way the armor was, they didn't have shoes. They basically had they didn't have shoes that were complete. They had basically a bottom part and then they had a top part that fit over the foot. But there was always an open space where the heel was. That was like the one opening. So anyways, an arrow ends up scratching Achilles' heel as he's riding away on his horse. And that injury becomes infected, and that's what ends up killing Achilles, which is where the saying Achilles' heel comes from. What's your weakness? What's your Achilles' heel? Obviously for Paris, it was women. So this war basically goes on for 10 years. And this isn't like the Iraq war where people are serving a year at a time. I mean, you're there the whole 10 years, you know, that's it. And of course you lose a lot of people. They've had plagues that have gone through the units. A lot of people dying from sickness and illness besides just in the constant warfare. But they're never able to topple Troy. They don't have any kind of major siege armaments or anything at this time. There's no, of course, cannons, but they don't even have catapults, trebuchets, any of that stuff. So this is where the reputation for cunning for the Greeks comes in, and also the saying, beware Greeks bearing gifts. So what the Greeks do is they basically say, fuck it, we're done guys, we give up, we surrender, we're going home. So they take all their 1,000 ships, load them all up, everybody gets on board, they build this they build this offering to the god Poseidon for a safe voyage home and leave it on the beach. It's this giant wooden horse. So what happens in the story is that the Trojans decide to fuck up the offering for Poseidon. So they grab the horse and they drag it inside their gates, and I don't know, maybe they're going to have a big fire or something with it. But they're all so excited and celebrating that they, you know, won the war and that the Greeks have left, that they all get super drunk and loaded, and then they all pass out. And now in the wee hours of the night, Odysseus and the few other Greeks who are hiding up in that horse, man, they pop out the secret trapdoor in the bottom, jump down. Meanwhile, all of the ships have turned back around and have come back and have all landed back on the beach. And you have the entire Greek army out there waiting. And they open up the gates, and there we go. Now you've breached the great walls of Troy, and they're able to pretty much slaughter everybody in their sleep. And so then they basically rampage, pillage, and burn Troy to the ground and sail home with that problem dealt with. And so, like I said, they actually have found archaeological sites now that they've attributed to the original city of Troy, and it was burned to the ground in about the 12th century BC. So it does look like there's definitely a basis for the stories, even if all the stories themselves aren't 100% historically accurate. Another story by Homer, the Odyssey, is basically the story of the return from Troy by Odysseus and his men, who end up spending another 10 years trying to get home. Of course, they're sleeping with sirens and fighting with cyclops and have all kinds of fun. The wives were just like, yeah, it really took you 10 years to get home, bitch. What you been doing? So it is a great example of where if at first, second, and third you don't succeed, well, try thinking outside the box. So this is another example of where one good idea could succeed, where thousands of men armed failed. Alright guys, that's it for our Miscellaneous Monday. Hope you enjoyed the tale of the Trojan War and maybe understand a little bit more about it and a couple of those sayings that come from that time period. Maybe now you can kind of put them in place. I would really like to almost do a historical overview, basically from the earliest great hydraulic civilizations in China and the Indus Valley, the Sumerian Mesopotamian societies, and sort of how that evolves into ancient Greece, and then to Rome, and then to the Dark Ages, European history, Reformation, Renaissance, all that stuff, right up through Napoleon nationalism, and then a couple of great world wars. Alright guys, I now return you to your regularly scheduled Monday programming. See you tomorrow for Topic Tuesday.